Everybody, welcome to this meeting of the Pondicherry Book Club. Usually I select a local writer, a writer from Pondicherry whom I can present before you, or a book which is set in Pondicherry, or a book on Pondicherry history. But of course there are exceptions. Sometimes I pick a book which could be interesting for the general public, or especially the young, because it's the young who need to be shown how interesting books are. As you must have noticed, a lot of people have stopped reading books, and those who do, and there's really a handful. Probably this habit of reading books will slowly disappear as more and more people will move on to watching videos. But as long as books exist, let's celebrate them. So this evening, I present to you Manoj, who is on the screen. This is not the first time. When about 2.5 years ago, I had presented Manoj once before, but I felt that it wasn't enough and I hadn't said everything I wanted to say, so I thought of bringing him up again. He is probably the most awarded writer of Pondicherry. Even though he was not born here, but he spent the greater part of his life here. So he is one of the best known Pondicherry writers. But unfortunately, he's not so well known by everybody in Pondicherry. So, let me just give you a brief outline of his life. He was born on 27th February 1934. And strangely enough, he died also on the 27th, but it was the 27th of April 2021. He was born in Baleshwar, which is a district of Orissa, adjacent to West Bengal. In his youth, he was very active in students' politics and politics in general. He studied in Cuttack, and he obtained a master's degree in English literature from the Ravenshaw College. Then he taught. He was a lecturer of English in Cuttack in one of the colleges. And then he came to Pondicherry, he and his wife came to Pondicherry to visit the ashram. And they were so impressed by it, they were so moved by it, and that very first visit they decided they would settle down here. So within a few months, he wound up his life in Orissa and he came here and settled down in Pondicherry for good, he and his wife Pratikya Devi. As long as, this was way back in 1964, when he settled down here. He had already started writing and publishing even before he came to Pondicherry. But even when he was in the ashram and he was teaching, he still continued his writing. He was already a writer of fiction, but he also used to contribute to several national newspapers. But the unique thing about him is that, or let's say the special thing about him is that he wrote and published in 2 languages. He wrote in Oriya as well as in English. There are very few people who can write equally well in 2 languages, because we tend to think in one language and to express ourselves better in one language. There are very few people, I don't say there is nobody, there were a lot of people now I don't know how it is. But for example, Girish Karnad, he wrote in Kannada as well as in English. In the same way, Manoj Das wrote in Odia as well as in English, and he published in both. The level of his language was equally good in both the languages. So, even though he continued to live here and write and publish, he remained an iconic writer in Orissa. He was very well known, and his short stories especially were part of the syllabus in many colleges, schools and colleges. A lot of people know him from their school days in Orissa. Of course, he was given many awards and recognitions by the Orissa government. So when I started, I said he's one of the most highly awarded writers of Pondicherry. So he was not only Padma Shri, but also he was awarded Padma Bhushan. But sadly, that was posthumously. He had just passed away when this Padma Bhushan was awarded to him. He was given a fellowship of the Sahitya Academy. He also had the Saraswati Samman and many awards in Orissa. So, although he died in 2021 during the coronavirus pandemic, he didn't die of COVID-19. He died of other age-related issues. But when he died, the Chief Minister of Orissa at that time, Naveen Patnaik, phoned the Chief Minister of Pondicherry and requested him that Manoj Das should be given a state funeral. And so, at that time, nobody was allowed to go into the burning grounds because of the COVID. But even so, the Pondicherry police went and gave him gun salutes, and he was given a state funeral in Pondicherry. But it was considered as if it was a state funeral, for the country. But in Orissa also, people were happy that he was given a state funeral. So, today I'm going to choose one of his short stories to introduce him as a writer from his. This is the book from which I'm taking a story. It's a book full of, it's a book published by Penguin, and it has his short stories, but I have chosen one. Now, as I told you, when he came and settled down in the ashram, he was given the work of looking after a hostel of children who had come from Orissa. I was one of the children that he looked after. And this particular short story that we are going to read, I so clearly remember him telling us this story. Of course, I was too small to understand what was the whole point of the story. But when I read it as an adult, I realized it was a very beautiful story. And as you know, a short story, as we know, the modern short story, is a story which usually has a twist at the end. That is the format of the modern short story. So initially I thought that I would talk about Manoj Das, then I'd talk about short stories, and then we'll read the story. But now I've changed my mind. We'll read the short story first, and then we'll talk about short stories in general. So, Tanay and Gaurab and I will read the short story which I have chosen to present. So the short story is called The Bridge in the Moonlit Night. At times, the moon appeared so big and so close to Ashok's balcony that he wondered if he could say hello to it and even reach it in a few bounds and shake hands with it. But since evidently it had no hands, he wondered if it would do to plant a kiss on it. Relaxing in his easy chair, Ashok loved to chit-chat with the moon, particularly when it was full. He had just told it, "I crossed 80 years, some years ago. What about you?" There were moments on such moonlit nights when he could see elves and fairies. He was surprised that they never aged, playing hide and seek among the silver-rimmed clouds and atop the starlit trees on the faint horizon. He enjoyed their frolic to his heart's fill, but often dazed off in the process, and, what was intriguing, still continued to see them. His only problem was he could not say how much of those playful beings he saw while awake and how much while asleep. He was aware that this queer forgetfulness had slowly begun to creep into his other activities too, even those gross in nature. For instance, this is what happened that very evening. He had been delighted at the alluring color of his cup of tea as it reflected the sunset sky. He had had a warm sniff of its steam, but his happiness drove him into one of those sudden snoozes. A little later, upon being reminded that his tea was going cold, he felt amazed that his satisfaction at having drunk the tea in his dream was not a whit less than the satisfaction he derived from actually drinking it. But whatever be the condition of his memory, he was proud that age had not dimmed his vision to any lamentable degree. He attributed this to his feeding at his mother's breast till the age of 5, being her last child. But his pride had suddenly received a jolt, and that was only a while ago. The bridge on the small river 2 furlongs away was no longer visible to him. Every time he woke up, he rubbed his bleary eyes and tried to locate the old familiar structure, but in vain. Was the moon playing tricks with him, withholding its beams? He glared at the moon. He then looked at the clump of trees on the horizon, where he was accustomed to see the silhouette of the Taj Mahal. But he could see that all right. This was an annoying problem. He solved it by quickly dozing off. The footfalls dragging up the stairs, however, were enough to rouse him. They were Sudhir's, as familiar as the talks of his own walking stick. Although younger to him by a decade, Sudhir gasped for breath while climbing. But to Ashok, the ascent was hardly more difficult than a leisurely walk. What was more, he had lately begun to have unusual experiences while climbing the steps. For example, on the last occasion, he had fallen asleep midway up the stairs, although for no more than a minute. But that was sufficient for his mind to lose the entire sequence of events. He had just returned from a delightful round in his son's car, but on reaching the balcony, he had concluded that he had just got to the portico. He had looked for the car and had succeeded in rapidly recovering his sense of perspective and complimented himself on that score. To mistake ascent for descent and vice versa was no hallucination of any alarming proportion, he assured himself.
Come, Sudhir. Should we go out for a stroll?
Ashok extended his hands for Sudhir to help him stand up.
Where on earth to go? The bridge was the only place.
Sudhir lamented, looking in the accustomed direction.
Yes, the bridge. Let us go there.
Look here, Ashok Bhai. You must shake off this forgetfulness of yours. what they call amnesia. Where is the blessed bridge? Why do you think we haven't enjoyed any stroll for a full month? They have pulled down the dear-old bridge to its last brick. They plan to erect a new one, a stylish one, with a number of jetties on both the sides for the taxpayers to enjoy their evenings around crotons and bougainvillea, cracking nuts and sucking at ice cream. In no time, it will turn into a fish market, I'll bet.
So they spoke with some anguish.
So that's it? The bridge is just not there? That explains why I couldn't see it. No doubt my memory is fooling me. Your case is different, you are young.
Not as young as you think, Ashok Bhai. I will be 80 in a year or two.
Well, at your age I could.
Ashok's muttering grew feebler, and he began to doze halfway through his observation.
You are under an exaggerated impression about your age, Ashok Bhai. It's so common to read about centenarians nowadays. What are you before them? A mere octogenarian. Ashok Bhai, are you falling asleep?
Oh no, Sudhir. I must confess though that I doze off from time to time. But that keeps me fresh. Now, should we make a move towards the bridge?
Ashok Bhai, did I not tell you for the umpteenth time that the bridge had disappeared? How fast you forget things.
Sudhir sounded disappointed. From the restless movement of his limbs, it was obvious that Ashok felt embarrassed. But soon he regained his composure.
You are right, Sudhir.
He said,
I keep forgetting much of what people tell me. There was a time when it was necessary to forget a whole lot of things, but then the memory proved too diligent to let a single item slip from his custody. And now it is imperative for you to remember at least few things. Who else will care to remember for you when you are old and out of tune with the rest? Memory betrays you.
But you lack no care, Ashok Bhai. Hasn't Providence placed you amid a host of kind souls who will remember for you all you need to?
A host of kind but colorful souls. Despite all their goodwill for you, they must dab your affairs with their own tastes and preferences. So much so that you will fail to recognize what was yours. No, Sudhir. Others can't remember for you, just as others can't forget for you.
Ashok Bhai, after a long time you are talking with as much sparkle as you used to when you were our professor. How dramatic it was.
Dramatic, was it? I don't remember. And look here, Sudhir, on second thought, there is so much peace in forgetting things. I am in peace, believe me, with my, what you call, amnesia. My instant snoozes of which you complain are nothing but symptoms of my peace. Would death prove gracious enough to close in on me while I was in one of those snoozes?
Ashok's vibrant voice assured Sudhir that he would not feel sleepy for some time to come. He dragged his chair closer to him and, after a little hemming, said,
Ashok Bhai, for a long time I have been trying to make a confession to you. No longer can I keep the anguish bottled up in my heart. Will you kindly bear with my babbling for a few minutes?
Go on, Sudhir.
Sudhir hemmed again and rolled up his sleeves and changed his position. He passed a few more seconds ensuring that there was nobody in the vicinity to overhear him, except for a cat on the sofa. He waggled his stick at it and it walked away more in disgust than in fear.
Ashok Bhai, you remember Meena, don't you?
There was no response from the listener.
You remember her, don't you? Meena, my distant cousin, 2 or 3 years older than I, the beautiful Meena. Wasn't she a student when you were the star of our college? A young lecturer? Who could have outshined you in gait and glamour, in that spick and span look you had about you? But let me go back to Meena. We had put her up in our house. To cut the story short, I mean the very Meena you were in love with. Ashok bhai, you are listening to me, I hope.
How can I do otherwise? Go on, Sudhir.
But will you first tell me whether you remember Meena or not?
What a silly question. Did you not say that I was in love with her?
Thank God. Yes, Ashok bhai. You loved her, and I suspect you grew thin yearning for her.
Never to grow fat again.
But you fattened me, and I have remained fat all my life, feeding me like a pig because you used me as the courier of your love letters to her. And how wonderful those letters were. I have rarely come across such moving sentiments either in fiction or in poetry.
Sudhir, don't tell me you were unkind enough to read my private letters to Meena.
Pardon this sinner, Ashok bhai, but I did read them. I read not only your letters but also the solitary one she had written to you in response. Of course, that was how I learned that she too had come to set her heart upon you.
No, Sudhir, she had not. And she did never write to me.
She did, Ashok bhai.
Ashok sat silent without taking his eyes off the moon, which had grown brighter after emerging from a fragile scrap of cloud. The lone eucalyptus that stood touching the balcony continued its whispering in the steady breeze. The grandfather clock rang out a resonant 7:30.
I am lucky.
Ashok's voice assumed an unsuspected vivacity.
I don't care to call for any proof of what you say, Sudhir. But I wish you had told me of your love for me earlier. I could have considered myself lucky for a longer period, that's all.
There lies the knot, Ashok bhai. What do you think I am feeling so guilty about? You certainly remember how shy, how delicate Meena was. But she had at last yielded to your entreaties. She had written a small but sweet reply to your epic love letters. In fact, she had agreed to meet you at the bridge.
Sudhir paused for a moment and then resumed.
And indeed she did come, but had to go back feeling humiliated, for you did not turn up.
How do you say so, Sudhir? I never received any letter from her.
Ashok asserted in a trembling voice.
How could you have received it, Ashok bhai?
Sudhir faltered and tried to clear his choking throat.
Did it not fly away while I was crossing the bridge in a sudden gust of wind?
Fly away. Let us go and look for it.
Ashok made an effort to get up.
After 60 years?
Sudhir laughed nervously. Ashok fell back into his chair.
Ashok bhai, I must confess that the letter flew away only after I had read it and torn it to shreds. In fact, I offered the shreds to the rolling flood under the bridge. I can still see them flying away like butterflies.
Ashok sat silent.
I do not know why I did so. You will certainly agree that I was not villainous as such. I admit that I was deeply attached to Meena. I could not have wished for anything but her good. My affection for you was no less, but that was tinged with a sort of fear. I was afraid that Meena would be entirely lost to me and to herself too if she married you. My apprehension, needless to say, was sheer stupidity. In any case, I was to lose all contact with her the moment she left our house, which she did before long, on the receipt of a message about her father's fatal illness.
Sudhir played with his stick nervously.
Ashok bhai,
He resumed.
all this hardly mattered to me as long as I was engrossed in my vocation. But since retirement, whenever I visited the bridge, the memory of my treachery became a terror and haunted me like a ghost. It has plagued me for 10 long years. I still feel puzzled over my conduct that evening, 60 years ago. Ashok bhai, I wonder if you will pardon me. But believe me, if I was a rascal, over the years by pretending to be good, I have become good.
Sudhir stopped. Someone was climbing the steps. It was Mahindra, tired but excited. Ashok Babu, if I am still capable of walking quite fast and even climb steps without much difficulty, it is entirely due to the inspiration I draw from your example. Now tell me, Ashok Babu, how on earth could you reach home so soon? I saw you from the other side of the dismantled bridge. I called out to you. It appeared you were too engrossed in looking for something on the dry riverbed to respond to my call. I just took a turn to avoid trudging through the debris and came over to your side. Alas, you were gone. You will overtake a hurricane, Ashok Babu. Who would believe that you are older than I? Observed Mahindra, still panting.
But Ashok bhai hasn't been out all this evening. You must have seen someone else.
Said Sudhir. Ha! Can I ever mistake someone else for Ashok Babu? And in this bright moonlight? Well, Ashok Babu, you must have been back here only a few seconds before me. Am I right? Mahindra waited for half a minute for Ashok to reply. Surely he has fallen asleep, he then observed.
But he never sleeps so deep at this hour. Ashok bhai, do you hear?
Sudhir called out rather loud. Ashok Babu! Mahindra joined in louder.
Ashok bhai?
Sudhir gave a shake to his old professor and friend. The next moment he screamed out.
Who is there? Phone up the doctor quick. Where is the switch for the light, Mahindra? Oh God, I forget everything.
So that was a short story, with a twist at the end. So now we'll talk a little bit about short stories. Short stories as we know, the modern short stories as we know them, it is said was started by Guy de Maupassant in the 19th century, a French writer. But ever since then it has become very popular, and every language has its collection of short stories. It was quite a tradition some years ago that every Sunday paper or every magazine would have a short story for people to read and enjoy. I remember the women's magazines that I used to read when I was younger always had a short story. There are lots of short story competitions all over the world. There are prizes to be won. Thousands of people send their short stories to be for these competitions. Sometime a couple of years ago, the Times of India had started a short story competition where a well-known short story writer would give a sentence that you had to include in your story. You could include it anywhere, but that sentence had to be included. So every short story competition tries to give some conditions which you have to fulfill, so that there is a certain, there are some constraints. Usually the short stories have a word limit, a word count limit. often between 3,000 and if it's very long, then 5,000 words also can be, you can go up to 5,000 words. But as more and more people are beginning to read less and less, even the short story is becoming shorter and shorter, and you have what is known as flash fiction, where a short story has to be written in 100 words, just maybe 4 or 5 lines, not more. Because who wants to read an entire story nowadays? Nobody has the patience. Everybody has their own favorite short story writers. My personal favorite is Jeffrey Archer. I think he's really the king of short stories. There is such suspense, and the end is always a fantastic twist, like in this story. And there are always, that is what keeps you reading till the end, because you want to know what happened at the end. And you usually expect a twist. But not all short stories have a twist at the end. Even there are many writers who wrote short stories which were just evocations of something, or reflections, or a story that just started and ended without really a twist. Most people who love writing have always tried their hand at writing a short story. Even if not everyone can write a novel, most people do want to give it a try to write a short story. So everybody knows that there are some, how to actually craft it. I don't know if there is anybody in the audience who has written short stories. I had invited one of our friends, Kamalini Natishan, who has published a collection of short stories, but unfortunately she said there was a wedding and she had to go and she couldn't come. So the short story also has a craft to it. Is there anybody who has written a short story?
As a student in David's class, I've written.
Yes, almost everybody has written short stories as students. It's always a thing that most teachers ask you to write. So everybody knows it's not that easy.
But now as I'm doing my PhD, so I know short stories, how it is supposed to be and what is the difference between short story and novel.
Yes, so can you tell us something?
First, as you already mentioned, one thing, if we are going to write a short story, we have to keep in mind also that we have to tell the entire thing in short. So many details will be missing. So that is the first thing. Because novel is going to be thick, so whatever details about the sentiments, feelings, and even the descriptions and all that will include. But if the same content we want to put in short stories, so we just have to, the idea should be delivered.
Yes, that you can't indulge yourself in writing long descriptions or long dialogues. You know that you have to keep it very short, to the point, very succinct, very compact. In a novel, you can write something, come back, add something. Usually in a short story, when you're writing, you have to remove something so that it's not too rambling, so that the attention stays on the progression of the story.
So in my previous job, I was asked to write short stories which were of 12 sentences. So these short stories were teaching English to the Chinese. So we had to write stories in 12 sentences, and we also had to prepare questions, 12 questions from those 12 sentences. And that was like a course material. But that was a very interesting exercise actually, because you are limited to number of words and sentences, and yet it was like a competition, because quite a few of us wrote stories and not all our stories got selected. Only the ones that got their attention, whoever was reviewing them, were selected. So I would say that we wrote about, let's say if we wrote 15 stories, only 3 were selected. So that was the ratio.
It's true. It's not, and very often the one who has written it can look at. it's very difficult as a writer to know what your reader will catch, how much of it he will absorb, what he will appreciate. We feel so satisfied that I've written a fantastic story, but when you ask somebody else to read it, very often they haven't got what, the communication hasn't passed, or you haven't really been able to convey that thing with that much of a punch. Very often short stories have very few characters so as to keep the whole thing very tight. You don't introduce too many characters, you don't introduce too many things happening, and you know that the end must really be a revelation. So you have to, sometimes they say every word has to be weighed. Does this word deserve to stay in the story? If not, then just take it out. But also some authors believe that it's not like that. You don't have to weigh every single word, and you can just keep it to the point. But ultimately the reader is the actual judge. The reader, how much you have been able to convey to the reader is understood only when the reader actually gives you a feedback. You may have thought that you will understand, but maybe you won't. So, as they say, there's always a slip between the cup and the lip. You don't know what's going to get not absorbed. Tanay, what about your experience writing short stories? Have you written anything?
Yeah, just as a student.
But did you find it difficult, easy?
Yeah, it's very difficult to write a short story.
Why?
Like she said, and you also said that it has to be compact and it has to convey a lot of information. And the twist, I mean, if there is a twist, it has to be satisfying enough for the reader to have taken that journey.
Yes. You often have to write and rewrite until you feel it has become compact enough.
Short stories have also been made into films.
Yes, short stories have also been adapted into films. There are so many short stories, so many films which...
Tagore turning the Tagore stories into two metraj.
Yes.
3 stories together.
That's true. Satyajit Ray's Teen Kanya, which in English for some reason is called Two Daughters, because when it was made for the international market, they only included 2 films and not 3. So, yeah, whenever I try to look for Timber, it came up with 2 Daughters. So, yes, short stories by Tagore have been made into films. And at that point, the filmmaker has the liberty to expand on it. Because, yes?
As you had mentioned, these short stories also, like Barrier and all have been made into French films.
Has the La Parure made into a French film?
Yes, I watched it.
Oh, how fantastic. Because that's really the short story that set me off. I mean, it stayed in my mind for years and years. It just, caught my imagination as to, it stayed somewhere in the back of my mind. Also, I must say,
the movie is for around 35 minutes.
only 35 minutes. Yeah, it can't be longer than that. You can't expand it more. There was a film, it was a Tamil film. It was about a Muslim man who is a salesman in a cloth shop, and how at the end there's a riot and he's caught, and we see through the film his daily life, the mundane life that he leads, and at the end of the film he's just killed by a mob, and you see him just lying dead on the road, and the mob runs away, and that's where the film ends. And the main actor of that film was Kumaran, who used to run the theatre, Indian Nostrum Theatre, and the short story apparently had been written by a Gujarati man who lived in Coimbatore. There are a lot of Gujarati families who moved to Tamil Nadu generations ago to be part of the textile industry. And he was one of them, and he wrote the short story in Tamil. and the filmmaker, it was published, I think, in a collection of, or I don't know, maybe in a paper, newspaper, and the filmmaker picked it up and he made a fantastic film out of it. Yes, indeed, there are some Bollywood films also based on short story. Premchand's short stories.
Short stories are cinematized very often, even now, and quite a lot of those stories are not dated yet. Then there is Manto also.
Yes. Sometimes even English short stories have been turned into Hindi films. You know, this The Last Leaf by Owen Ree has been made into a film. The Gift of the Magi has been made into a Bollywood version of it.
So actually, when we were in college,
knowledge, our English teacher David, this was a routine thing that he did with all the students of the first year, and it culminated in short story competition in that batch. So see, as we are talking about short stories, you know, there are more and more short stories that are surfacing as we are talking about the subject. There are short stories which are made in films, short stories which are written regionally, and short stories which need not have to have a twist. There's a short story about Sharat Chandra, who gets attached to a dog, and he's little on the outskirts of West Bengal, and the dog comes to greet him, and it's time for him to go because he has recovered from his illness, and he's just attached to the dog. So that's the short story, and it's so well written. So there are so many short stories that come up as we talk about short stories. So when come back to David, when he started this competition, it started with short story reading, and that was also sort of a competition, and it turned into a frenzy because amongst us we tried to compete, like who would read more short stories. Some of us also lied, saying that we read this story and just to increase the number, but it did. So we were in the hunt at that time because we had to just keep reading more short stories before we actually start writing your own. So that was a very good exercise, and short story has that quality of itself, like it can really get you into that frenzy of reading and finding out more stories. There were a lot of stories of Somerset Maugham, slightly longer stories.
Yes, and even well-known, yes.
I have one question here. You say that they gave you an exercise to write short stories, but the story writing has to come spontaneously from the person. That is what we have been hearing. So it is not to be exercised that one can develop writing, but it should come on its own. That is what we hear. What is your comment on it?
Actually, there is, of course that is true, but unless you have done something, you don't know how to appreciate it. Until you have done that thing, you don't know how hard it is to do that thing. If I have never written a short story, I will never really get to fully appreciate a short story. If I have never, for example, played a game of tennis, I will never understand the fine points of that game of tennis. Or if I have never really done gymnastics, I will never really know how difficult it is for the gymnast to do what he or she is doing. So, as a teacher, very often teacher asks the students to write it so that by doing it, you will understand the difficulties of that work, and when you read a short story, you will appreciate it much more. Those who don't understand cricket, they don't enjoy it because they don't know what are the fine points. But if you play cricket, then you know, how hard was it to hit that ball, or how hard it was to get that catch. Only if you have done it, even for a short while, you understand its inside story, as you say. So it's true that you don't have to make a film to be able to appreciate a film, or you don't have to write a novel to understand a novel. But if you have done it even a little bit, you will understand how tough it is. I can tell you once Anurag Kashyap had come to Pondicherry to give a screenwriting workshop. I joined it. There were about 30 people. Many had come from Chennai, some from Bombay, and we did this screenwriting workshop for 1 week. And he said, don't come to the workshop if you have not tried writing a screenplay, because you will not understand anything which I am telling you. So we were supposed to write at least half a screenplay, and I can tell you it was so tough. And even after the workshop was finished, many of them were actually already working with some people, but nobody in that group had ever written a full screenplay. And I can tell you, I tried finishing that screenplay that I started, and I just couldn't. It's been 10 years. I sometimes pull it out of my drawer and try to continue. It's a format that is very difficult. I have written a novel, but I can't write a screenplay. I have written short stories, but I can't write a screenplay because it has a format. And I assure you, after that workshop, whenever I saw a film, my attention was on the screenplay. I could understand how it was written, how the balance was done, how it was started, how it ended. And I can tell you my perspective of watching a film completely changed after that, because I had tried and failed at doing what somebody had actually done very well.
Yes, Dr. Pranani, I would also like to add to what Sunayana said here. So, if you were never put into that exercise, you would have probably never done it. You were quite lazy, and we knew that it was part of the course. But when the time came that we had to write our own stories, it had to be original. So most of us, some people had very strong imagination. They could come up with very original stories. And a lot of us actually derived from our own personal life, something that we have encountered or a personal crisis that we have experienced. So the stories were not, some were really good, but some were, you could see that people have drawn it from their own inspiration of life. And that's how, because if we wouldn't have done that exercise, we would have probably never written any story at all. And similarly, in the school they made us write sonnets. I never thought that I want to become a writer. As students, you do these exercises. But at some point in my job it did help, because I had to write that 12-sentence short story. And I was thanking my teacher David for making me do that exercise.
This intention to ask that question came because there are some courses how to write a poetry. What their intention is, what they say is that we bring a note about the different poets and teach to them, so that they grasp the thing, and after that they begin to write poetry. So I was having a this is about a 6 weeks course. So I became myself doubtful, is it possible to write a poem? After hearing the poets well known, and my intention was, if you write a poetry, it should be emotionally coming out from you.
Absolutely.
And that will be a greater poet and also a greater poetry. That is my thinking.
Sure, yes, that is true. That's true. But if you try doing something, you'll understand how difficult it is. That is also there. What time is it?
5 minutes.
Okay, so I think we will wind up here. I'd like to add something I forgot to tell about Manoj Das, is that after his passing away, the government of Orissa instituted an award for literature in his name. It's called the Manoj Das National Award. It is given to any writer whose work is judged worthy by a panel of 10 judges. Anybody can, the award is instituted by the government of Odisha, but anybody can apply for it. And the the rule is that you can apply for it only if you have already written 10 books. Then and only then you can send a book for this award, and then if the judges find it fit enough, then they will give you that award, which is called the Manoj Das National Award, and it carries a cash prize of 10 lakh rupees. So it's quite something. So that his memory is kept alive. And I have heard that in the village where he was born, apparently they have built a museum to him and his brother, Manoj Das. Both of them have been very eminent people in their memory. So he continues to be a very well-known person in Odisha, and with the passage of time, people forget. People, those who are very well-known slowly get forgotten. But of course, through their writings, authors live for longer, filmmakers live for longer. As they say, life is short and art is long. So people live through their art and they become immortal. So with that, we would like to remember Manoj Das, and I request you to go and find his books. His books are available on Amazon. I don't think you'll find his books now in any bookshop, but if you do find, do read them. And also, I must say, although we have said he was a writer, etc., he was a fine gentleman. He was an extraordinary man, always humble, always loving, always full of encouragement to others. He never behaved like he was some. If you met him, he was absolutely self-effacing. Always remembered all the people that he knew. We continued to get his love and affection even when we were adults, even though he knew us from the time when we were little children. And sometimes I find it hard to believe that he's no more, because he was such a person who was always present and always present in our thoughts. It's difficult sometimes to think, oh, but he's no more. That, I think, is also very important. No matter how good you are in your profession, there is also this aspect of how wonderful you are as a human being that counts also. Very often people who have achieved great success in their professions sometimes lose that touch with the common man, the touch with people, and take themselves, their success very seriously. But there are people who continue to be very fine human beings. Their behavior is always gentle, kind, polite to others, and that always stays in the mind. Always that becomes such an important point. How good a human being was that person who also was a good writer. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for having come.
One more thing which we have to mention about him, he was a Marxist.
Yes.
At the beginning, he was a Marxist.
Yes.
And when he came to meet Shyambulo and mother,
Yes.
immediately he changed himself.
True.
Yeah, that is one of the great points.
Yes. He was very, very politically active. He was a Marxist, and he had seen poverty in the village where he grew up, and he always said this is something unjust, unfair, etc. But it is true that slowly his mind completely changed. He was fortunate enough to have seen the mother, and it's true that he was not only a writer of fiction, but he did a lot of historical research, and he wrote till the last year of his life. He wrote a biography of Sri Aurobindo, which was not a complete biography, but up to half of his life. And he did a lot of research into it, and people were afraid that he might pass away. He was already unwell, and he was in the nursing home when that book was in the press. People were afraid he might pass away without seeing that book in print. But fortunately, that book came out of the press, and he passed away just, I think, a month after that, if not less. And everybody gave a sigh of relief that at least they could bring it out before he passed away. So, to tell you, he was writing till the very end of his life. And a lot of philosophical thinking, he edited the magazine. He had started a magazine called Heritage, which was published by the people who were publishing the Chanda Mama magazine. Chanda Mama came out from Tanay, and it was in several languages. It was a very, very popular magazine decades ago, and those people encouraged Manoj Das to start a magazine. It was called Heritage, and he always collected articles on the mystic side, the occult reality, spirituality, the stories, articles, keeping that as the main focus. Unfortunately, it didn't run for very long, but he used to tell me that his publishers were very kind. They had given him a long rope and said, you know, you can, even if you lose money, we are prepared to lose money for a while. If this magazine can go for some time, we'll see how far we can go without really feeling the pinch. And he did continue for quite a while until they saw it was commercially completely unviable, so they stopped it. There we are.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually. Gaurab took these 2 copies for us to read today from the library, from the Sri Aurobindo Ashram library. And we found later that it was actually gifted by Manoj Das himself shortly after its publication.
He signed it, it's a signed copy which he had given. And you see, this, I bought this from Bach where there were several copies, and they told me, you know, nobody's buying it, nobody's buying all of the other, we just have to take them out. Indeed, they took out all the unsold copies. There weren't any left when I went back now to look for 2 copies for them, and evidently they had gifted those unsold copies to the Ashram library. So there we are. So, thank you very much for having come.